The Committee on Homeland Security will come to order. The committee is meeting today to receive testimony on U.S.-Iran tensions implications for Homeland Security. Without objections, the chair is authorized to declare the committee in recess at any point. Good morning. Today, the committee is meeting to examine the Homeland Security implications of the recent escalation in U.S.-Iran tensions in the wake of the killing of Qasem Soleimani. Iran and Iranian-linked terrorists have shown a capability and willingness to conduct terrorist attacks against the United States and our allies and interests abroad. Clearly, the escalation of tensions between the United States and Iran could have dire consequences for the security of the homeland. More broadly, the suspension of U.S.-led counterterrorism efforts against ISIS in the region, ostensibly in order to focus on the threat from Iran and its proxies, may allow ISIS to reconstitute in unsecured areas of Iraq and Syria. This would dramatically undermine the fight against ISIS and make U.S. interests abroad and home less safe. As members of Congress, we have an obligation to do everything in our power to protect our constituents by defending the nation from physical attacks, cyber attacks, and influence campaigns designed to undermine our democracy and sway public opinion in favor of Iran or its friends. I'm deeply concerned that President Trump has no strategy and his administration has failed to plan adequately for addressing the Homeland Security consequences that might follow military actions in Iran. The administration must immediately put forward a measured, comprehensive strategy that accounts for potential threats to the homeland from Iranian actors and their proxies. As part of that strategy, the Department of Homeland Security must ensure it is prepared for all contingencies related to the escalation in U.S.-Iran tensions. I look forward to a frank discussion today about what the strategy should be. I'm particularly interested in understanding how Iran could use its relatively sophisticated cyber capabilities against state and local governments and critical infrastructure to extract revenge for the death. We need to understand whether potential targets are prepared to defend against Iranian cyber threats and what the federal government can do to help them if they are not. Although there have been no specific threats to the critical infrastructure, escalation of tensions with any adversary demands that we take stock of all the current measures we employ to defend ourselves. This is particularly true in the case of Iran, a country that is unpredictable in its responses and hide behind proxies and sympathizers to do its dirty work. Toward that end, I'd be remiss if I did not note that the Chemical Facilities Anti-Terrorism Standards Program is set to expire in April. Although the House has begun work on reauthorizing this important anti-terrorism program, the Senate has not. At this point, it is unclear if the Senate intends to work with the House to reauthorize the program. I urge the Senate to begin work on this national security priority. It would be irresponsible to allow the program to lapse at this time. Finally, in recent weeks, we've seen an uptick in Iran's influence activity on social media. I do not need to tell anyone here that it is an election year and influence activity is bound to increase. Given the committee's election security work, I'm concerned Iran might escalate its influence activities as we approach the election and what more the federal government and its private sector partners should be doing to counter Iranian messaging. We need to be prepared to confront and defend against Iran's influence efforts and ensure the integrity of our democracy and our most sacred institutions. We are fortunate to be joined by witnesses with vast experience with the Department of State, defense, and homeland security, as well as expertise in matters related to Iran. I look forward to a productive discussion today and remain committed to ensuring this committee does its part to help secure the homeland from threats posed by Iran, its proxies, or any other who would do to seek to harm Americans. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Rogers, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Iran has been escalating tensions in the Middle East for decades. Since the nuclear deal was signed, Iran's malign activities have only increased. The $100 billion in assets released by the Obama administration helped Iran enhance the manpower and capability of its terrorist proxies. It helped Iran to conduct vicious cyber attacks on private industry and allied nations. It enabled them to grow their missile stockpiles and improve their lethality. 6 months after it signed the JCPOA, Iran conducted ballistic missile tests with missiles carrying the inscription, quote, "Israel should be wiped off the earth," close quote. It's clear that the Obama-era policies of appeasement did not work. The president was right to take the United States out of the JCPOA and reimpose sanctions. The president understood that the JCPOA was not going to contain Iran. That flawed deal was doing nothing to end the very clear and direct threat the Iranian regime poses to the United States, Israel, and the rest of our allies. For over a decade, Iran has funneled money, terrorists, and advanced weapons to its proxies in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, who use them to attack U.S. troops and Israeli citizens. In doing so, Iran is responsible for the deaths of over 600 Americans. The latest American murdered at the hands of Iran was a civilian contractor and father of 2 young children in California. Fortunately, the president took decisive action to eliminate the brutal terrorists primarily responsible for his death and the deaths of thousands of others. Qasem Soleimani was sanctioned as a terrorist by the UN and the Obama administration. For over 20 years, he led the IRGC's Quds Force, a foreign terrorist organization. Soleimani was not visiting Baghdad because it was a great holiday destination. He was there as some peace envoy. He was not there as some peace envoy. He was there to meet with the leader of a terrorist group to plan more attacks on Americans. The president used the law and his constitutional authority as commander-in-chief to eliminate this terrorist mastermind before he could kill again. For the first time in years, Iran received the message that there will be no real consequences should they continue to threaten that there will be real consequences should they continue to threaten the United States and our allies. I hope Iran understands this message and finally ends their malicious and destabilizing actions in the Middle East. I also hope that the Iranian regime understands that the United States will not hesitate to defend our homeland against any threat that they advance. For years, the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, and other law enforcement partners have kept close watch on Iran's intentions and its capability to strike our homeland. The threat from Iran is real. We know they continue to shelter senior al-Qaeda leaders and allow them to conspire with other terrorists. We witnessed their cyber attacks on our industry and local government. We thwarted their plots to conduct assassinations in the United States, and we've arrested their operatives for surveilling critical infrastructure and plotting attacks on our homeland. We must remain vigilant in the face of these threats. It is more important than ever for Americans to report suspicious activity and to law enforcement at every level to share information and intelligence on threats to our security. Nearly all committee members attended the threat briefing with senior DHS officials last week to learn more about the Iranian threat and the department's response. I want to commend the Acting Secretary Wolf for the actions that the department is taking to mitigate the threat from Iran. I look forward to continuing this committee's bipartisan efforts to ensure DHS has the authority and resources it needs to successfully counter the threat from Iran and other sponsors of terror. I thank the witnesses for coming. I thank each of them for their service to our nation. I look forward to a constructive hearing and good discussion on what actions the government should take to counter the threat from Iran. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Other members of the committee are reminded that under the committee rules, opening statements may be submitted for the record. I welcome our panel of witnesses today. Our first witness, Ambassador Barbara A. Leaf, is the Ruth and Sid Lapidus Fellow and Director of the Jadud Program of Arab Politics at the Washington Institute for the Near East Policy. Ambassador Leaf served as the U.S. Ambassador to the United Arab Emirates from 2014 to 2018. Next, we're joined by Lieutenant General Vincent R. Stewart, who served as a special advisor and chairman of Middle East Media Research Institute Board of Advisors. Lieutenant General Stewart formerly served as the Deputy Commander of the U.S. Cyber Command and Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. We're also joined by Mr. Thomas Warwick, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Mr. Warwick previously served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism Policy at the Department of Homeland Security from 2008 to 2019. Finally, we're joined by Brigadier General Anthony Tata, the CEO and President of Tata Leadership Group. After retiring from a 28-year career in the United States Army, Brigadier General Tata recently served as North Carolina's Secretary of Transportation. Without objections, the witness's full statement will be inserted in the record. I'll now ask each witness to summarize his or her statement for 5 minutes, beginning with Ambassador Leaf.
Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Rogers, distinguished members of the committee, what comes next after the January 3rd killing of Quds Force Commander Qasem Soleimani and a senior Iraqi militia commander? In my view, we cannot take literally Foreign Minister Zarif's statement that with Iran's missile strikes on U.S. forces in Iraq, Iran has concluded proportionate measures in self-defense. Rather, we are in a pause in an escalatory cycle. The factors driving this cycle are numerous, although Soleimani's quest to drive the U.S. from the region is long-standing. The essential stalemate between Washington's maximum pressure campaign and Tehran's maximum resistance campaign. Tehran's view that it is already in a war, an economic war waged by the U.S. Its leaders' conviction that they have staying power and tools that the U.S. lacks. Attacks on shipping, assassination, terrorism, formidable regional proxies, providing Tehran myriad ways to continue countering U.S. pressure. Thus the impasse, thus the continuing threats. I will focus here on Iraq and the Persian Gulf, where Tehran will almost certainly revert to a campaign of pressure. In Iraq, Tehran is long judged it enjoys a decisive advantage over the U.S. in influence and coercive tools. In the Gulf, Tehran has repeatedly demonstrated to Washington's closest allies their strategic vulnerabilities are acute, notwithstanding the presence of long-standing U.S. military facilities and thousands of U.S. service members. In Iran, Soleimani leaves behind a well-oiled, disciplined machine acting on behalf of a regionally powerful, if economically stressed state. In Iraq, Iranian-affiliated militias are pushing hard to fulfill his vision, forcing the departure of the 5,000-strong U.S. military training mission. The pressure is unrelenting within the government, on Shia and Kurdish politicians, and most brutally against Iraqi protesters who reject both Iranian interference and the recent threat-induced parliamentary vote. The Iraq of 2020 aptly reflects Soleimani's efforts. In Iraq, always weak vis-a-vis Iran, and the government itself suborned and weakened by a set of proxy-armed actors not under the state's control and largely pliant under Iranian direction. Today, some 36 such militias operate in Iraq, commanding some 60,000 members. They flout Iraqi law and the Constitution, operate training sites and arms depots that are no-go zones for the Iraqi security forces. They have repeatedly targeted U.S. military sites and U.S. diplomatic facilities over the past 18 months, participate in Iran's program to transfer advanced missile technology to Lebanese Hezbollah, and targeted the Saudi East-West pipeline. Whether these militias will take on a future Hezbollah-style role abroad, acting on Iran's behalf, is as yet an open question. While fully half of the 70,000 to 80,000 U.S. forces deployed in the Middle East are ranged across the 6 GCC countries, these countries have felt extraordinarily exposed and vulnerable amidst escalating tensions between the U.S. and Iran and Iranian attacks on Gulf energy infrastructure and oil tankers in 2019. They are acutely vulnerable to Iran's full suite of asymmetrical tools, cyber in particular. A prolonged takedown of the electrical grids alone would be devastating. I will say that the administration's responses throughout that period of last year's attacks by Iran were contradictory and somewhat confusing. This and the lack of U.S. response to the earlier attacks appear to have led Tehran to calculate that it bore little risk of reprisal, especially in September 2014. Why do these activities in the Gulf or in Iraq via proxies matter for U.S. Homeland Security? Number one, oil. Notwithstanding the new U.S. role as an energy megagiant, oil remains a global commodity, its price affected directly by security or insecurity in the Persian Gulf, carrying a knock-on effect for economies, including our own. Number two, counterterrorism. Our ability to pursue robust counterterrorism efforts with dependable allies directly affects our security at home, sustaining critical training for Iraqi security forces, intelligence sharing, and acquisition, leading the enduring defeat of ISIS in Iraq and Syria are now very much in question. ISIS cell attacks in Iraq alone last year numbered nearly 900. If we are compelled to pull U.S. trainers from Iraq, sustaining them in Syria will be impossible in my view. And finally, regional stability. In Karim Sajipour's words, Qasem Soleimani's sinister genius was marshaling both Sunni and Shia extremists to bring a wrecking ball early to the U.S. project in Iraq, then building out a foreign legion to expand Iran's influence far across the Arab Middle East. His project of constructing parallel institutions to the state that subordinate and follow foreign direction is vividly on display in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. It's a recipe for chronic instability and insecurity across a widening arc of territory that is home to nearly 70 million people, the globe's fourth largest oil producer, source of a global extremist scourge, and source of more than 8 million refugees. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. I now recognize Lieutenant General Stewart to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Rogers, and the other distinguished members of the committee. I'm honored to be here as an advisor to the Middle East Media Research Institute, an organization for the last 20 years that looked at the social and intellectual currents within Iran. I'd like to step back just a little bit as we talk about the situation in Iran as this continues to unfold. I believe it's more important than ever that we pause and put whatever short-term actions Iran takes into a longer-term context of Iran's desired end state. We should strive to remember during times of tension that the regime's tactical actions are ultimately a means to an end and not the ends themselves. With that, I'd like to start with Iran's theory of victory or their desired end state. Iran believes that it is the dominant regional and cultural power, and the United States and its allies in the region are impediments to Iran's desired end state. The Iranian government believes they are the victim of U.S. actions, are in fact rational actors protecting the region and themselves from undue foreign influence. Iran believes it will successfully force the United States to leave the region, but the question is, since we're obviously stronger conventionally, how does Iran believe it can accomplish its end state? Iran understands that its military capabilities will not deter the United States from conducting military actions and that they would eventually be overmatched by our armed forces. Iran has built a capable force that would impose cost on the United States, its allies, its forward staging bases, and its interests in the region, but cannot militarily match U.S. capabilities in the long term. However, Iran views asymmetric activities as a viable low-cost means to eject the United States from the region. Iran's asymmetric warfare can be viewed as a three-legged stool, comprising of support to malign actors and terrorists, information operations, and a range of cyber activities. All of these components are part of a long-term campaign to make the U.S. cost of staying in the region untenable while eroding support for the United States and avoiding the threshold of an overt U.S. military response. Since Iranian military support to terrorists and malign actors are covered extensively in classified reporting, I'll focus on the second and third legs of this stool. Iranian information operations, influence operations are not well understood and target several audiences. The most important is their own domestic population, which the regime seeks to keep united around nationalism and a perceived victimhood. Like-minded terrorists, militants, and religious groups are also key constituencies. Iran's fastest growing audience are international, Russia and China, and increasingly U.S. allies in the region and abroad. Lastly, I want to highlight that with the rise of social media and ease of transmitting messages, the Iranians increasingly see different factions inside the United States as information operation targets. That includes building upon the divide between Democrats and Republicans and convincing the American people that we have no interest in the region, that the only thing we can expect from the region is enduring warfare, and therefore we should withdraw. So what are some of the messages from the Iranians? Geography matters. Iran has no options of leaving the region. We have a population of 80 million people. We have a rich history of culture and heritage, and we will be here when the Americans leave. In spite of the propaganda, what they perceive as U.S. propaganda, that they're destabilizing the region, that they're in fact rational actors on the international stage and conform to international norms of behavior. And they go through this litany. We've complied with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. We've taken responsible action to defend our country after the attack on Soleimani, and so they continue to emphasize those messages. The bottom line on Iranian information operations is this: anything that gives the regime narrative a boost is a victory on the path to Iran's theory of victory. Their three-legged stool of asymmetric warfare is carefully calibrated to make the cost of U.S. presence high while cultivating an image of being rational actors and victims. All actions and reactions must be viewed through those lenses. The third leg of their asymmetric warfare is cyberspace, and we'll spend a good bit of time talking about that during this hearing. Since the Stuxnet event, Iran has embarked upon a comprehensive approach to develop both offensive and defensive cyber capabilities. And we've seen them exercise those capabilities against nation states, Saudi Aramco, against small companies, against our own financial system, and the Sands Casino in 2017. In the interest of time, the Iranians are not as capable as the Russians or Chinese, but they have expressed their intent to develop both offensive and defensive capabilities. They are partnering with other countries to learn, share, and counter our interests. They have demonstrated an ability to conduct attacks incurring costs of private U.S. companies, foreign entities in the multi-million-dollar ranges. They will include cyberspace operations as a key component of their asymmetric response to the killing of Soleimani. What makes this foreign threat so unique is that this is the one area where the U.S. government is essentially telling the U.S. private sectors to fend for yourself. And I'll stop there and look forward to your questions.
Thank you for your testimony. I now recognize Mr. Warwick to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Rogers, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify. 1 week ago today, the IRGC fired 22 missiles at 2 Iraqi air bases. According to the New York Times, if the attack had killed Americans, the options put in front of the president would have included cyber attacks to disable Iran's oil and gas sector. It's important this committee asks whether the United States oil and gas industry would have been ready for the Iranian cyber attack that would have followed. Here's another question, not hypothetical. While Americans celebrated Thanksgiving, someone hit Iran with a massive cyber attack, publicly disclosing 15 million Iranian debit card numbers on a social media site. The Iranians made the rare concession that this was, quote, very big. It's important this committee asks if our bank and credit card companies are ready if Iran tries to hack the card numbers of millions of Americans. In my testimony, I'm going to discuss the 4 ways Iran threatens the homeland. I want to make 3 preliminary points about Iranian cyber attacks, and then focus on Iran's peculiar sense of symmetry as a means of understanding how they would carry out threats. Mr. Chairman, Iran's 4 possible attack vectors are terrorism, cyber attacks, disinformation, and influence operations. Of these, terrorism is the least likely in the short term, but it's still possible. The last state-sponsored attempted terrorist attack on U.S. soil was in 2011, when a group of IRGC Quds Force officers tried to assassinate the Saudi ambassador in Washington, D.C. Iran can also call on proxy groups like Lebanese Hezbollah. Number 2, cyber threats, I'll come back to in a second. Number 3, disinformation operations. Iran spreads false propaganda about the United States, including the false idea that the United States actually supported ISIS, which obviously was not true. 4th, influence operations. As General Stewart said, and as there was an outstanding expose in Wired magazine in August 2018, I'd note more recently, Facebook and Twitter have since found thousands of accounts linked to the Iranian government. Iran is getting better at influence ops. Let me go back to cybersecurity and make 3 preliminary points. First, Iran and its allies consider the United States, Israel, and Saudi Arabia as responsible for each other's attacks. To be sure, we hold Iran responsible for the actions of its proxies. Second, the Trump administration uses sanctions and cyber attacks as their go-to tools. U.S. officials have admitted twice on background to recent cyber attacks on Iran, and as I mentioned earlier, the option of a cyber attack if an American had been killed on January 8th. Third, the implication that it's safe for the United States to carry out cyber attacks against Iran is actually dangerous. Iran will retaliate, but the cyber defenses of Iran's likely targets are uneven. Mr. Chairman, this leads me to the most important point I'd like you to take away from my testimony. Iran's government follows a peculiar sense of symmetry. When the United States does something to Iran, Iran tends to respond, not in exactly the same way, but the symmetry is there. Some examples. After the January 2nd strike against Soleimani, the Iranian Supreme Leader told his National Security Council to, quote, strike America directly and in exact proportion to the attack, close quote. More strategically, in May 2018, United States maximum pressure sanctions slashed Iran's oil exports. Iran tried to show that if the United States could cut Iran's oil exports, Iran could cut our allies' exports. In May and June, with attacks on tankers and a Saudi pipeline, then with the September 14th Abqaiq attack that briefly cut Saudi oil exports in half. Another symmetry. On July 4th, Britain seized an Iranian tanker that was violating international sanctions. On July 19th, Iran seized a British tanker. On August 15th, British authorities released the Iranian tanker. On September 27, Iran released the British tanker. There's symmetry in cyberspace. After Stuxnet targeted Iran's industrial control systems in 2010, Iran developed a similar offensive capability and used it here in the US in 2013. That took 3 years. In August 2012, Iran's Shamoon malware deleted 35,000 hard drives at Saudi Aramco. What got less publicity is that 6 months earlier, something called Wiper deleted data on national Iranian oil company computers. In July 2012, new US sanctions targeted Iranian banks. 2 months later, Iran ramped up denial of service attacks whose main attack targets were US banks. The symmetry goes in the other direction. When the Iran nuclear deal was enforced, Iranian cyber attacks appeared to drop. More recently, after the 2018 maximum pressure campaign, Iranian cyber attacks increased within 24 hours. After the June cyber attack against Iran, private US businesses noted an increase in Iranian cyber attacks. Mr. Chairman, let me briefly mention 3 points about what the United States should do to defend the homeland. One, first, anytime the US government thinks about cyber offense, it needs to focus just as much on cyber defense. Over time, Iran has improved its cyber capabilities, reduced its response time, and shown it is capable of strategic surprise. This is especially a problem with Iran because of their peculiar sense of symmetry. Anything we do to Iran is likely to do back at us. Second, while most federal government computers are protected, US civilian cyber defenses are uneven. DHS and the FBI both need more resources to work more closely with the private sector. Third, it's very good that DHS has increased its efforts since January 3rd by repeating earlier warnings, issuing new alerts, putting out a new INTAS bulletin, and jointly releasing a joint intelligence bulletin with the FBI. But the Trump administration needs now to increase and elevate its efforts to educate the American people about what they and we can need to do to protect ourselves. Iran is going to be a threat for the foreseeable future. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony. I now recognize Brigadier General Tatar to summarize your statement for 5 minutes, and I hope I didn't ambush your name too much.
Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Rogers, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me here today for the privilege of providing comment on the important topics of Homeland and national security. Killing Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, both specially designated terrorists, provides for a safer Middle East and a safer homeland in America. In strategy and in warfare, leadership, networks, and resourcing matter. Soleimani and Mohandas were experienced commanders overseeing a vast terror network that executed Iran's revolutionary strategy of exporting terror, backed by Iran's $26 billion military budget. Together, they carried out 3 decades of terror against the U.S. and our vital interests and allies in the Middle East, to include, but certainly not limited to, training, resourcing, and resupplying Shia militias in Iraq to disrupt U.S. operations, resourcing Hezbollah to attack Israel, planning and resourcing the thwarted attack on a Washington, D.C. restaurant a few miles from here, creating money laundering schemes within the United States to fund terrorism, protecting the bin Laden family, al-Qaeda leadership, and Taliban members immediately after the 9/11 attacks, training, resourcing, and transporting Abu Musab al-Zarqawi and other al-Qaeda members to fight coalition forces in Iraq, resourcing the Houthi rebels in Yemen to attack Yemen and Saudi Arabia, and resourcing and commanding multiple recent attacks against the U.S. interests in the region. Just as Osama bin Laden orchestrated the attacks that killed nearly 3,000 Americans, Soleimani orchestrated attacks that killed and maimed over 6,500 Americans through improvised explosive devices alone. Just as bin Laden continued to pose a clear and present danger to American interests worldwide until his death, so did Soleimani. Soleimani, however, was more dangerous than bin Laden because he was flush with resources from Iran, a designated state sponsor of terror whose defense budget has risen 60% between 2015 and 2018, from $16 billion to $26 billion. Soleimani developed, refined, and deployed explosively formed penetrators, lethal roadside bombs made of Iranian milled 6-inch copper discs, PVC or steel pipe, urea nitrate, a blasting cap, and typically a passive infrared switch trigger. When a target crossed the beam of the passive infrared switch, it ignited the blasting cap, which in turn detonated the explosives, propelling a molten copper disc at 8,000 feet per second through its mark, killing and maiming whoever might be in the projectile's path of destruction. Frequently, the destruction from an EFP sealed the vehicle doors shut, leaving American soldiers to burn alive. Often, Soleimani's EFPs were deployed in multiple arrays where several copper discs would punch through Humvees and other fighting vehicles, ripping arms and legs from servicemen and women. Soleimani and his chief lieutenant, Mohandas, were the masterminds behind and suppliers of these EFPs. Just in the last 18 months, 2 U.S. federal judges each separately found Iran liable for their role in killing and injuring Americans in Iraq by providing material support to Iran's proxy terrorist groups. Those U.S. District Court cases are Karcher versus the Islamic Republic of Iran and Fritz versus the Islamic Republic of Iran, which I have included in my testimony. Evidence in both cases proved that Soleimani and Mohandas, both senior leaders in Iran's IRGC Quds Force, acted on behalf of Iran to ensure Americans would die. Just one quote from witness testimony in those cases from General David Petraeus. The MNFI press conference he spoke at in April 2007 said, and there's no question, again, that Iranian financing is taking place through the Quds Force of the Iranian Republican Guards Corps to support opposition forces in Iraq. As they were moving freely about the region, coordinated terror with Hezbollah and Shia militias in Iraq, Soleimani and Mohandas presented themselves in a designated combat zone as the leaders of a designated terrorist organizations, the Quds Force and Kataib Hezbollah. President Trump responded appropriately under the same authorization of use of military force that President Obama used against state and non-state actors in Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Yemen, the northern tier of Africa, and other locations. While serving as the Deputy Commanding General of U.S. forces in Afghanistan in 2006 and 2007, I directed several combat missions to include drone strikes, artillery strikes, air assaults, and other operations, some of which found me on the ground with the soldiers conducting those missions. Everything I have seen, read, and understand regarding this strike underscores its legality, importance, and proportionate nature to reset the balance of power in the Middle East with respect to U.S. interests and Iranian influence. The Soleimani strike is consistent with U.S. national security strategy as it relates to Homeland Security. I brought a copy of the strategy today that the President published in 2017 that mentions pursuing threats to their source and defeating jihadist terrorists and dismantling transnational criminal organizations, both of which the Quds Force is. Practically, in my roles as an education leader here in Washington, D.C. and in North Carolina as Secretary of Transportation, and now as a Chief Executive with Air Data Solutions, I have been steeped in analysis of threats to the responsibility for specific homeland security, infrastructure, and citizens over the last 10 years. To include, I'm concerned about including cyber attacks on key infrastructure such as airport, air traffic systems, physical security of soft targets such as schools and mass transit for shock value, attacks on seaports to impact commerce, smuggling of weapons and other resources to enable attacks, and biological warfare against crops affecting our food supply. And finally, with Soleimani and Mohandas removed from the equation, we have an opportunity to positively reshape the dynamic in the Middle East toward peace and enhance homeland security. As a young United States Military Academy cadet in 1981, my classmates and I witnessed firsthand the return of U.S. hostages in Iran to American soil at West Point, where they spent their first weeks reintegrating. The cruelty of the Iranian Islamic Revolution is seared in my memory, and I'm personally proud that we have begun to fight back. Thank you, sir.
I thank all the witnesses for their testimony. I'll remind each member that he or she will have 5 minutes to question the panel. I will now recognize myself for questions. This hearing, U.S.-Iran tensions, implications for homeland security, is titled because a lot of concern has been expressed as to whether or not, with the recent incident in Iran, are we any safer, or are we safe, or what should we look out for? So the question that I'd ask all the witnesses is, with the events of recent time in Iran, what do you believe is the greatest threat emanating from Iran today to the homeland? Ambassador Leaf.
Mr. Chairman, I think in the immediate term, my biggest concern is the future of the status of the U.S. military mission in Iraq, for the reasons that I cited and that I went into greater detail in my written testimony. That is, the fight against ISIS is not over. The caliphate is gone, but the attacks happen daily across Iraq, and certainly there are thousands of ISIS members who have access to several $100 million of monies for their attacks. And so to the degree that we don't navigate the turbulence in Iraq well, we're going to see that mission pushed out, and that mission goes directly to Homeland Security.
General.
The question really is the missile attack against al-Assad and Erbil sufficient to say that we have done something and we can de-escalate and have a conversation? I don't believe that's sufficient to show the magnitude of the attack against Qasem Soleimani. So I expect that while not a direct terrorist threat to the homeland, terrorist threat globally has increased. If nothing else, Soleimani controlled, and I use that term advisedly, controlled the militias and the malign actors. I don't know who controls those actors now. I don't know which ones will now say we've got to take revenge as a result of this activity. So I suspect that there will be some terrorist activity globally, time and place of choosing that requires a good bit of planning, but not directly to the homeland. The direct threat to the homeland is if the rhetoric continues and we decide to do something in cyberspace. There are vulnerable areas within our cyber environment, both in the financial and the electrical power sector. So if we're not doing everything to harden those positions, again, the uncontrolled, if not controlled or deniable activities by the Iranians, we could see activity in cyberspace, and I'm very concerned about some vulnerabilities there.
Mr. Warwick.
Mr. Chairman, the possibility of a terrorist attack by Iran here in the homeland, is that a possibility? But cyber attacks are a certainty. Equally certain is that Iran is going to continue its disinformation operations and as well that Iran is going to find ways to try to divide Americans, increase divisions and conflict within our society, as Russia and China are already doing. I also do want to agree with Ambassador Leaf and go more to the point that if Iran succeeds in forcing the United States to withdraw from Iraq on Iran's terms rather than on our own, that will be a victory that we will be paying for many, many years. And finally, I also agree that the possibility of ISIS staging a resurgence is also a certainty, and the question is whether U.S. forces are going to be able to contribute to trying to prevent that from happening. So that poses a long-term danger to the homeland that we have to take into account.
General.
Mr. Chairman, the revolution in Iran, they have been chanting death to America for 40 years. And so I look at threats, are they willing and are they able? Certainly they are willing and they will remain willing as long as the theocracy rules Iran. And so the motivation to harm Americans has not really changed in 40 years. And the motivation to export terror has not really changed in 40 years. And what we have to look at is what is their capability, willing and able. They're totally willing. Now, are they as able today as they were before January 2nd? And my contention is with Soleimani removed from the battlefield and Muhandis, we don't mention him a lot, but Muhandis was a critical player in Iraq. With those two people, the leadership matters. And I liken it to removing the queen off the chessboard. He was somebody who moved around diagonally, straight forward, backward, to ensure that Iran was enabling its campaign of terror to disrupt U.S. interests, vital interests in the region. With him gone, we have an opportunity now, and Iran knows how important he is or was to their efforts. I believe that we have an opportunity. The individual who has replaced him was in the Afghan theater for Quds Force, not as familiar with ISIS, not as familiar with the Iraq theater of war, much less capable, doesn't have the elan that Soleimani had. I believe that we've got an opportunity now to have a diplomatic outreach.
I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Rogers, for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've all seen over the last few days the massive protests in Iran. And for the first time, they're not chanting death to America and Israel. They're pointing the finger back at the government, in part because my understanding is the economic pressures they're under there, which are just going to be exacerbated now by our European and other allies who are talking about implementing sanctions because of the shooting down of the airliner and then trying to aggressively cover it up. Theocracies always care about self-preservation more than anything else. Given this new level of tumult in their country, do you think that's going to heighten the chances of them striking out at us or striking out at those protesters? What consequences would that have to our homeland security here?
Ranking Member Rogers, I think the fact that they are a theocracy, I think the fact that they are, as you mentioned, are concerned about self-preservation, primarily what they will try to do is preserve their regime. And so as we look at what their capabilities are, as I mentioned, they are willing, they want to, it is good for their business to chant death to America and try to eliminate Israel and have that as their shtick, so to speak. And it is good for their theocratic ideologues that follow them. And how that translates into capability, they're very capable, particularly with the $26 billion defense budget that they've had this past year. And so what we need to do is understand that the threats remain because they are still willing to do it. And we have to do an assessment of the threats in light of the Soleimani strike. What is their capability? Command and control is a key fundamental factor on the battlefield. And it is a lifelong key factor. You know, Sun Tzu talks about it all, Clausewitz, et cetera. And this is something that we really must take into account is what is the future of Iran's Quds Force going forward. And as we kill enemy leaders, they also light up the network and begin to talk and make mistakes, and it provides new intelligence for us. And so we need to have right now a massive intelligence gathering operation, which I'm sure we do, that picks up on all of the dynamics going on in the Middle East between Iran and all of its proxies so that we can build target folders and continue to keep the pressure on the enemy.
Now, in response to the chairman's question, which I think is the key question for this committee and this hearing, is what vulnerability do we have to the homeland from Iran? And pretty much uniformly, y'all said cyber threats. Going back to my point about the economic pressure and the domestic political pressure that the Iranian threats have, do they really have the economic capability to put behind a serious cyber attack on our country?
Mr. Rogers, they do, and that's because they choose to prioritize expenditures on things like the IRGC Quds Force instead of the things that would make investments that would help their own people.
And you think that will continue even given the economic pressures they're having in the protests in the streets? Now, it seems to me at some point to just preserve yourself, you've got to start shifting that money back to let them have services again and money to buy groceries and things to be able to keep your power.
The cost of entering the cyberspace is pretty low.
Is that right?
If you can identify malware and you can, even if you get the limited amount of help in dissecting a malware, you can turn that into a tool that you could use. So the entry into this space isn't high. We're not talking about millions and billions of dollars, but it's fairly low cost.
From what we've heard from other panels, the cost for defensive capabilities is pretty high. That's one of the reasons, and Mr. Warwick talked about we need to put more money behind our defensive capabilities, more assets. So it sounds like the offensive threat is less expensive than the defensive capabilities.
So the risk to their networks, it's pretty expensive to defend that. But to develop a capability that could be deployed, whether for intelligence gathering, for disruption, or for decisive defeat action, that cost is not terribly high. Now, they've made a commitment to building their own intranet, building their own defensive capability. That was their first priority. But in terms of delivering offensive capability, that cost isn't terribly high.
And Mr. Rogers, if I could just address another element of your question. I mean, the monies required, the budget required. First of all, there's the prioritization, as Tom Warwick noted, the prioritization of these asymmetrical tools, including cyber, but also the proxies. If you look at Iraq or you look at Yemen, well, look at Yemen, that was a very low, small investment, high return in terms of the pressure that it put on Saudi Arabia and the pressure it put on us indirectly. In Iraq, those militias are some of them go back to the 80s, the Badr organization. The others came up on the battlefield after the 2003 invasion and during the fight against ISIS. They are parasitical. They are much like the IRGC moving into the economic space and preying on the Iraqi financial bodies. So that is, again, a way that Iran does things on the cheap.
Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you very much. Chair, recognize the young lady from Texas for 5 minutes, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Let me thank the chairman and ranking member. A byline that was cited by a number of news stations after the attack in Iraq on the soldiers was from a soldier that said, "I was 100% prepared to die." I think as we relate to the issue of the impact on the homeland, we must also recognize the human impact and the deliberative responsibility of this Congress and the executive to make informed, intelligent, and deeply strategized decisions. We are now living with the false information of weapons of mass destruction and the act of war before the inspectors were even allowed to determine whether they existed. We now call Iraq the endless war. So, Ambassador Leaf, I want to ask some questions, and I will appreciate your indulgence of quick answers. I want to get to all of the panelists. And I'd like to think that the American people, I'll declare, I do not intend to support going to war with Iran. But what do you foresee as the next direct military conflict between the U.S. and Iran?
Given the way Iran goes at conflict, which is the so-called gray zone, not head-to-head conventional conflict, it will revert to form. So attacks on shipping, cyber, et cetera, against partners. I don't see the immediate quest to take a strike at the U.S. because they're outmatched. But they will put pressure, they are putting pressure through Iraqi militias, and that is where the battlefield is. So I don't see a strike as such being the most likely prospect.
And do you think in using proxies such as the Shiite group and others could provoke the United States, however?
That's a question I really can't answer, but it appears that the administration has settled on a line that if an American is killed, that will elicit a response.
So we have the potential for escalation.
Yes, as I said earlier, I do believe we're at a pause, but we're still in an escalatory cycle.
It is clear that the president made false statements about the Obama administration giving $250 billion or $150 billion when those were dollars that had been retained, and they were Iran's dollars. So it is important to have accurate information to the American people and in the process of deliberation. Lieutenant General Stewart, you said Iran's fastest growing audience being Russia, China, and U.S. allies in the region. Can you please clarify how you see their potential involvement and also the detriment to those, particularly the allies in the region, including Israel, Kuwait, Jordan?
Congressman, I think probably more than anything else, the idea that we are not acting rationally and that they're conforming to international norms is the message and themes that they're trying to get to our allies and some of our adversaries. We, Iran, are more stable and more deliberative in our process. We won't escalate. We'll conform to agreements. We want to reduce the violence, none of which are particularly true, but those are the messages and themes that they're pushing to our allies and our partners.
And that'll be part of the false narrative, as well as saying, we'll stand by you when the United States will not.
That's
one of
also,
those.
That's certainly part of the messaging.
That only promotes danger for our soldiers, for the United States. Mr. Warwick, we are all concerned about cyber attacks. I sit on the committee dealing with that, on this subcommittee dealing with that, on this full committee. And so give us, you gave us really a good explanation, but give us a deep dive into how far into the cyber security system that can impact the average American if Iran chose to do so.
Representative Jackson Lee, the first thing to remember is that cyber attackers are looking for an open door. And so in an open society like the United States, in effect, all of us who have a computer, who have a home network, who have a small business, are now on the front lines and are subject to potential attack from a country like Iran. What this means is an entirely new dynamic. It's no longer sufficient for us to guard our military bases or our government buildings. We now have to figure out an entirely new strategy to work with the entire American public, to educate the American people on our collective responsibilities. And this is going to take, I think, an entirely different and stronger approach that I would hope would be led from the White House in a way that makes improving our cyber defenses a national goal, much like civil defense was a bipartisan national goal in the 1950s.
Gentlelady's time has
Thank you.
expired.
Yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Bishop, for 5
Thank you,
minutes.
Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. Specifically focusing on the purpose of today's hearing, there have been a number of claims in public and even maybe implications in some of the statements by members today that, that there was a lack of planning by by the U.S. government, including perhaps DHS, for the aftermath of what happened in Iran. And I wonder, is there anybody on this panel, we've heard a confidential briefing, but is there anybody on this panel who is intimately familiar with the details of the Department of Homeland Security's planning or lack thereof?
Well, I believe, Representative Bishop, that would be me, but I'm not going to get into any discussion of any classified matters at an open hearing, and obviously you would want to hear from the people at DHS who are currently working those matters as I left several months ago. But as I know you've been briefed, and as DHS leadership has said, there are quite a few activities, operations that are underway now that the department is engaged in to try to help protect the American people. I have no quarrel at all with any of those. Quite the contrary, I think they're excellent. I just think that there needs to be more of them and better funded from the Congress.
So to follow that up, Mr. Warwick, are such efforts as a general practice of long-standing? That is to say, they aren't thought up in a crisis, but they, as a matter of fact, are pursued on a regular programmatic basis.
The department realized after the Ababsiyar attack in 2011 that DHS had more actions going on against Iran than almost anybody else in the government realized. And I do have to say that that attempted terrorist attack on U.S. soil met with a very vigorous response from the Secretary of Homeland Security at the time and the entire department leadership. I was very proud of having been involved in that effort.
Thank you, sir. Mr. General Tata, you said in the course of your comments that you have to do an assessment of threats. Would it be your expectation that those assessments would be ongoing as a matter of course over a long period of time and not just started in response to a crisis?
That's correct, Congressman. The threat assessment cycle is one that is continuous, and it happens for overseas threats and for Homeland Security threats. The planning is all nested with the national security strategy that the President and the National Security Advisor put out 2 years ago, and it very clearly talks about pursuing threats to their source and defeating terrorists and defeating transnational criminal networks. And so that's where you see DOD and DHS and the joint planning collaboration that happens, where they assess threats and develop plans to counter those threats. And part of that planning is to fight the enemy on their 5-yard line and wherever they may be, and part of it is to defend our 5-yard line, to use a football analogy.
Thank you, General. General Stewart, in your testimony, you talked about Iran's objectives and its asymmetric activities, and one was to avoid the threshold for an overt U.S. action. It would appear that Iran miscalculated in this particular case. Wouldn't you agree?
Specific to the missile strike on the bases?
Yes, sir.
I don't think that was a miscalculation. I don't think Iran views that as a miscalculation. I think they viewed that as a demonstration that they would strike back, an overt demonstration that hit targets that they could reasonably tell their audiences that we've done something.
Well, I think what I'm getting at, and I'm not sure if I'm following you, General, I'm talking about the strike on General Soleimani and the killing of him. Are you saying that you think Iran anticipated that the United States would do that, or did they miscalculation?
No, not at all.
Okay.
Not at all.
And one other thing is that you said that the most important information operation they have is on their own domestic population, which the regime seeks to keep united. Based on events of the last days, would you say they've miscalculated on that as well? And in the interest of accurate information, I heard one public figure say that the killing of Soleimani is like killing Princess Di or Elvis. Would you agree with that equivalence? And do you think they've miscalculated in terms of their own population's reaction?
Their population reaction actually switched from a support to the reaction to the Soleimani killing, but switched as a result of the airplane strike. So there's no way that they could have calculated that if we make an accidental shoot down of a commercial aircraft, that the population would rise up in the wake of the cry for the outrage over Soleimani's killing.
Thank you,
So I don't know if I'd call it a miscalculation. They're not dealing with it well, and that causes some stress internally, but I wouldn't call it a miscalculation.
Thank you, sir. My time's expired. Yield back.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Correa, for 5
Thank you,
minutes.
Mr. Chairman. First of all, let me thank you for holding this most important hearing, and I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here today. Again, a very critical issue. I have a question for all of you on the panel here. As you know, Iranian General Soleimani built the world's largest terrorist network with international terrorists like Hezbollah. Now that he is out of the picture, how would you characterize the threats posed by Iran's proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, other militias, towards the United States and abroad? Do they have cells in the U.S.? Is this a threat, especially given, as some of you have stated, now that he's out of the picture, is there a call for revenge, and are there cells in the U.S. that could pose immediate threat to us? Ambassador Leaf.
Sir, I know that I know that Hezbollah has cellular networks all over the world, and I think it's clear that they have them in the United States. To my knowledge, this does not extend to some of the other proxy actors, but I think it's important to note, going back to your original question, that the Quds Force will survive, has survived, will survive and continue on the mission that Soleimani, the vision that he defined for the region. Certainly, it was a decapitation, and Ismail Khani, his successor, is a character of a different type. But I have no doubt that they will exercise the kind of command and control throughout their networks, whether it's Hamas, Hezbollah, and certainly in Iraq, in such a way that our interests will be threatened.
So, Ambassador, are you saying that command and control, despite his elimination, is still there, and therefore there's discipline in the ranks?
Certainly in Iraq, yes.
In the U.S.? The cells?
Well, I'm going to defer to Tom Warwick on the issue of Hezbollah.
Thank you. General Stewart?
I don't know. I won't speak to cells here, but the estimates are 20 to 80,000 members make up this militia. 20 to 80,000. Some of them will remain under command and control of the RGC Quds Force. My greater concern are which are the ones that will go rogue with the intent to avenge the death of Soleimani, the martyred Soleimani.
That's a question mark.
And that's a question mark. I don't know how many, but even if a small percentage.
Mr. Warwick, I'm running out of time. Excuse me, Mr. General Stewart.
So there was the recent disruption of a Hezbollah group, including one of their sleeper operatives. It would be foolish of us to assume that by taking one out that there aren't others that need to be addressed by the FBI at the proper time and place. I do agree, though, with General Stewart and with Ambassador Leaf that the Iranians would regard it as a ruthless but good trade if the United States were forced by Iran to leave Iraq. If all they thought they had to pay was the price of one of their generals, I'm afraid the ruthlessness of the regime would make them think that was a good deal for them.
General Chanta.
Yes, Congressman, it's well documented by the FBI and Southern District of New York and open source and other places that there are sleeper cells here in the United States, both for the Quds Force and for Hezbollah. Financing, I've referenced in my opening statement about the hundreds of millions of dollars that were being laundered by Hezbollah in the United States, a case brought before the Southern District of New York or by the Southern District of New York. And the FBI intercepting the plot by the Quds Force to attack a restaurant a few miles from here in Washington, D.C., It would be naive of us to assume that there aren't other cells that we have not yet found. So they exist, and as far as command and control networks of Quds Force, you take out, you destroy part of that network. Certainly they'll regroup and reassemble, but you cannot overestimate the impact of killing Soleimani, in my opinion.
General Stewart, we talked about the capabilities, cyber offensive capabilities of Iran. Is there a possibility that they could team up with Russian experts and come up to a greater level of threat to the homeland if they were to do that?
In their own words, they've talked about partnering with a number of countries to include the Russians, the Pakistanis. So in their own words, they've talked about sharing and collaborating. So if they do that, they certainly can increase their capability.
Mr. Chair, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Crenshaw, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I'll start with you, Ambassador Leaf. You mentioned the importance of the mission in Iraq, and that's a contentious issue across the political spectrum. Could you address directly why we have a mission in Iraq, and address directly the slogan of "No more endless wars"? Why are we there? What's the U.S. interest?
The importance of the U.S. military training and advisory mission in Iraq, it goes precisely to a Homeland Security issue, which is ISIS, which continues to regenerate in Iraq and, of course, across the border in Syria. So that is forthrightly the mission, and I think it's a critical one. Now, the size, the shape, the duration, so forth, is a question that we should have a very strong voice in. And I agree firmly with what Tom Warwick said earlier. If we are seen to be pushed out by this collection of a militia-affiliated actors in Iraq, or the militias themselves, we're going to lose critical intelligence. The Iraqi security forces will lose critical training and assistance to be able to counter that threat that goes beyond their own homeland.
Related to that would be the question of Iranian influence in Iraq. If we were pushed out, it would become an Iranian proxy state, if you will. Does that affect U.S. national security? And related to that question, do you see the PMFs becoming the next Hezbollah?
So the way I look at it is Iraq is at real risk of becoming a militia state. And as such, will again pose a threat to the security of not just the neighborhood, but more broadly in the region. We don't want to return to the days, Saddam's days, when Iraq was a real threat all across the way. So there are a multiplicity of these militias. They are, as I said, predatory, parasitical. They are thuggishly repressing hundreds of thousands of Iraqis who turned out with a quest to turn Iraq into a normal state. Iraq is not fully normal yet, and it is in our interest to stay the course and help them do that, not only through this military mission, but the military mission is a critical component of our reason for being there.
Right. Well, I want to move on to General Stewart and information operations that you mentioned. You talked about the use of social media by the Iranian government to spread their misinformation campaigns. In the last couple of weeks, how have you seen any change in that, and how have they used the hyper-divisive reaction to Soleimani's killing and the media narratives out there? Have they used that internally to spread their own misinformation campaigns?
I have not seen that yet, but I anticipate that they're laying the foundations to use the divisiveness. They're laying the foundation for the divisions, the social divisions within our country. We've seen them talk about doing that. Yeah. But in the last 10 days, I have not seen an increase in that level of activity.
And for both Mr. Warwick and General Stewart, as far as the symmetry that you talked about, does Iran currently have even close to symmetrical capabilities as far as offensive cyber warfare against the United States? Is this something you're worried about in the future? Are you worried about it now? Because it's not as if we don't receive attacks from Iran in the cyber realm every day.
But you're right on that, Representative Crenshaw, but it's a fact, as General Stewart said, that offensive cyber operations are cheap, defensive cyber operations are very expensive.
I understand. I'm trying to get a sense of the capability as it stands now.
You don't have to have the same capability that the United States or Russia has. You only have to have one that can impact the electrical power grid on the east coast of the United States. And the cascading effects of that one device, and that's why it's asymmetrical.
I agree with that. My question is, it's not like they haven't tried, right? I mean, in Texas, we had 10,000 attacks. So are they not implementing their full capability yet? Is that your assessment?
Well, we call every event an attack.
Yeah.
And it might be reconnaissance.
Yeah.
It might be simply probing. It might be an attempt to simply deface. All of those are precursors to the attack.
Right.
But generally, we're pretty cavalier about an event that occurs, an anomaly on a network, and we can attribute it as an attack. It doesn't mean that they don't have that capability and could, in fact, turn those probing events into a destructive event.
And Mr. Warwick, you're very familiar with CISA and what they've been doing in the Department of Homeland Security. Is there anything they're not doing that you would suggest that they improve upon? Because they have made quite a few steps in the last couple of years to improve upon cybersecurity in the homeland.
So if you look at the entire number of cybersecurity specialists that CISA has, that number would be dwarfed by putting one or two of our banks together with the number of cybersecurity people they have. So the staffing disparity of what's needed to protect the country is very different. And this is one of the things that I would hope this committee and your colleagues on the Appropriations Committee would work together to address. We have totally mismatched the idea of offense and defense, because in the military realm it means one thing. It's totally different in Homeland Security and cyberspace.
Gentlemen,
Out of time. Thank you, Mr.
Texas
Chairman.
time has expired. Chair recognizes the young lady from New Mexico, Ms. Tara Small.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. And esteemed witnesses, I really appreciate you being here. I want to pick up on Congressman Crenshaw's questions about national security. I recognize that what's being said here is that that's the most likely attack we'll continue to see. And Mr. Warwick, you described it as a certainty at this point that we'll continue to see it. I'm very interested in your conversation about a security gap that exists between federal entities and some civilian entities, and most troubling of which are critical infrastructure and financial institutions. So my concern is, as you talked about opening a door and lots of attempts to open those doors, and such that all of us are now a threat, how do you see that impacting more rural utilities or smaller utilities like water, wastewater, energy, and what can we do to address that threat?
So what the Iranians, as other potential or actual cyber adversaries, face is they literally try computer system after computer system until they find somebody that has not updated their software, that does not have antivirus software, that has failed to use two-factor authentication, that has failed to do all of the basic things that really need to be something that we start teaching in America's schools. This needs to be done exactly in the way that we did the civil defense campaign in the 1950s. The difference then being that a nuclear attack was a horrifying possibility, but a cyber attack these days from our adversaries like Iran is an absolute certainty. And so I would hope that this would get a lot more attention across the board and at all levels. What would not be something that any of us as citizens would want to see is a very destructive cyber attack by an adversary that has achieved strategic surprise against us, as the Iranians have shown that they can do, and that there would have to be something like another 9/11 committee, or dare I say it, even a Pearl Harbor committee that would look into how did we miss this. And I'm telling you right now, Representative, that the mismatch between what CISA has in the way of resources and what the threat is a strategic vulnerability to the United States homeland.
Mr. Warwick, thank you so much for that. And I think looking long-term in terms of education, I think is very valuable. In terms of short-term and the staffing challenges that you described and the resources, again, I want to get back to rural and small utilities. What kind of resources does CISA need? What types of expertise we need to facilitate that type of outreach?
So the larger utilities obviously have more resources. The smaller utilities are more uniquely vulnerable, but cover, as you know, large areas, and therefore there is more at risk. This is very much a situation where ways have to be found, obviously, to do various risk-based measurements. CISA has a considerable amount of expertise in trying to do those risk-based assessments. So I recognize there has to be prioritization, but I also recognize that our adversaries have a very different prioritization and will look for the weakest target that they can find in a way of showing their dominance over us in cyberspace.
Thank you very much. And just shifting gears slightly, in the last time I have, in the event of a successful cyber attack against the United States, what is the likelihood of an attack being linked to the actual actor?
One of the challenges is that although the attacks take place in seconds, as General Stewart knows better than any of us, having been at Cybercom, it can take days, weeks, or months to try to sort out who is responsible. This is an asymmetry that we have to recognize, and I don't think there's any substitute for it. I would defer to General Stewart.
Attribution remains a challenge, but we're seeing the actors who use certain techniques, certain tools, certain approaches, so it's getting a lot, I won't say a lot, it's getting easier to attribute, but it's still, I could give a tool to a proxy, and that proxy could use that tool in multiple domains to get to the target, which really makes it hard to define who does it.
Are there specific resources that the Department of Homeland Security could apply to increase the ability for correct attribution?
The least significant but most important is one that I know my colleagues have been asking for, which is the ability to require American businesses who've been hit by a cyber attack to disclose relevant information to the department so that they can begin understanding and assessing this.
The private sector believes that the department has a lot more intelligence that can attribute to targets than we actually do. The reality is in the private sector, there's a tremendous amount of intelligence capability, how we share that data. And this is why it's so important, this public-private partnership. The sharing of the data, the collaboration in real time is critical if we're going to attribute and react in a timely manner.
Thank you. My time's expired.
Thank you very much. Just for the record, this committee led a bipartisan letter to the appropriators that got CISA $350 million more dollars, and we plan to go back again and say, based on some of the conversations today, because we're still behind in terms of capacity, and we can only get that capacity with investment. So.
Yeah, and Mr. Chairman, we want to thank, as private citizens, I think the members of the committee for doing that, because that was hugely important.
Absolutely. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing. I thank our witnesses for appearing today. I'd like to dive into the, some would say, controversial killing of terrorists. I personally support the killing of terrorists in the battlefield, including President Trump's decision to order precision strike to take out known and brutal terrorist Soleimani. Iran is a threat to our homeland, continues to be the leading state sponsor of terrorist groups and proxy terrorist groups across the world. They provide shelter and training for terrorists that intend us harm. They are no friend to the United States of America. When I say they, I mean the Iranian regime, not the Iranian people. One of my best friends, who's been my friend since 1984, was an Iranian citizen that was stuck in his country. He was going to college, and when the Ayatollah Khomeini took over and the radicals took over Iran, he was stuck in the country. If he went back, he'd be shot. To this day, he can't go back. So Iran, the Iranian regime, is the issue and the threat they pose to our nation, both our homeland and abroad, not the Iranian people. The Iranian people are beautiful people. I've come to know their culture through my friend. But the Iranian regime is most certainly a terrible issue that we must confront. I think I'm going to ask a question to Lieutenant General and the Brigadier General, both my generals. General Stewart, I'd like you to address, if you would, in your written statement, you mentioned the divide between Democrats and Republicans with the narrative of how this thing is rolling, especially on social media. You said that that's used by the Iranian as, quote, information operation targets. Can you explain in greater detail what that means, please?
Just like we've seen with other foreign governments who've taken every divisive issue, every divisive social issue, and have amplified it in the social media space, so that long before we even cast a vote, we've made a determination as to which side is telling the truth. We've seen this done by other nation states. We see this being done by the Iranians. Pick your socially divisive issue, any one of them. Create an environment, and I won't call out any social media platform, create an environment, create the messages, drive people to those left and right lateral limits. And I've often said, publicly and privately, I'm not afraid of the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, or anyone else. I'm concerned about the divide in our country. And social media allows that divide to occur, and lots of us are amplifying those horrible.
Well stated, and that division, as it becomes manifest and publicly consumed on social media, is a tool that Iran used to recruit. Is it not?
I don't know how much recruiting they use that means, but they do cause disruption in our society and division in our society. It certainly could be used for recruiting.
Thank you for that clarification. Brigadier General Tata, in your written statement, you described that the world is a safer place because of President Trump's call to kill the known terrorist Soleimani. In your opinion, do you believe that we're prepared to counter any future attacks by his successors, although there's some uncertainty, as there should be? We shook him up regarding who that successor will be. Do you believe we're prepared?
I do believe we're prepared. I think the intelligence and communications and special forces and combat force posture throughout the Middle East is appropriate and to defend U.S. vital interests, which are defense of people, property, and the shipping lanes. Those are the key U.S. vital interests that we have, and of course to be able to root out terrorism at its source, to disrupt attacks on the homeland. So as we, in the days after, weeks, months after the strike on Soleimani, the key for us, in my opinion, is that we have to have an intelligence apparatus that can continue to collect information so that we can make informed decisions about how to continue to disrupt the terrorists that want to do us harm. And that, to me, is fundamental more than anything else going forward.
Thank you for that answer and your clarification, your service. Madam, gentlemen, thank you for appearing today. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Rose, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and for gathering this extraordinary panel. I must say as well, whenever Mr. Higgins speaks, I always consider yielding all my time to him, but I will resist. In the immediate aftermath of the killing of Qasem Soleimani, something that, for the record, I did support. There was a concern regarding reaching out to jurisdictions regarding a potential terrorist attack, cyber attack. As a New Yorker, we saw that there was a strong communication between the JTTF, NYPD, and DHS. But what I'm concerned about is that we don't know what we don't know about our communications with other jurisdictions. In your experience, does CISA, DHS as a whole, do we have contacts with every locality? Have we built communications with every jurisdiction? And do we have a means of at least grading whether they are up to a certain requirement, whether it be counterterrorism or cybersecurity? I'll begin with you, Ms. Leaf.
I think that really falls outside my bailiwick of expertise, and I would defer to my co-panelists.
Of course, thank you.
I can't completely speak to this except for when I talk to industry partners who do not believe there's a great connection between their requirement at the let's say, a small or medium-sized bank to the right connection within DHS to the right connection inside the IC. So from a commercial standpoint, the sentiment is we're not well connected. I don't know how the Homeland Security is connected to the municipalities and governments, but from a private sector standpoint, they don't feel well connected.
And so to square the circle, Congressman, someone at DHS could show you a map that says that the entire country is covered by fusion centers, that the entire American economy is covered by sector groups that meet with specific sectors. That much is true, but the reality is how many people are there within those JTTFs and how many people are there within those sector groups to reach out to all of the American state and local law enforcement, private businesses, and others. That is what produces the gap that General Stewart has correctly identified.
And do you think that this gap is something that we should be trying to analyze and establish some type of metric?
I wouldn't spend a lot of time analyzing it. The gap has to be addressed in a very serious way and urgently, lest we find ourselves the victim of strategic surprise from somewhere.
Congressman, as former Secretary of Transportation in North Carolina, I had a law enforcement agency. I worked very closely with emergency management in North Carolina. I worked very closely with the Department of Public Safety, the equivalent of DHS at North Carolina's level, the Department of Transportation's work with the Highway Patrol. All of those entities have a fusion cell in emergency management, and we worked very closely with FEMA and DHS. And what I saw a few years ago when I was in that position was close coordination between DHS, FEMA, and other law enforcement agencies such as the FBI. Now, can everything be improved? Always, yes, but at the time, the infrastructure is there, and so it may be time to rejuvenate that, to put some emphasis on that.
Lastly, my last minute, can you speak to the potential for, and I don't think this is considered nearly enough, the potential for a cyber attack combined with a lower skill terrorist attack? Iran seems to have both capabilities. And do you see that on your threat landscape?
It's certainly in the realm of possibilities, but I don't see any indication of that. And I think that would be highly escalatory, which would be counterproductive for the Iranians.
It's also true that the people who do terrorist attacks and the people who do cyber attacks from Iran don't talk to each other.
Can you expound on that?
The way Hezbollah and the Quds Force have organized their terrorist activities is through very tightly held stovepipes. This is a matter of public record. This isn't the least bit sensitive. If you look at the way the FBI and the Department of Justice detailed the actions of the Hezbollah sleeper operative who was recently convicted and sentenced to 40 years in prison, you can see how tightly stovepiped Hezbollah kept its operatives. Cyber attacks are done through totally different mechanisms. That's detailed in General Stewart's testimony, and it's done through different mechanisms. It would be quite something if they could combine those. Let's hope they don't.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Joyce, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding such an important hearing today. It's no secret that the Iranian regime is no friend of the United States. If I could just briefly summarize the highlights from some of General Tada's comments today that we heard. General, you testified broadly that Soleimani was a specifically designated terrorist, and his murder, his removal from our continent, from our world, from our lives, makes for a safer Middle East and a safer homeland here in the United States. I, for one, could not be in more agreement with this. Soleimani was a terrorist who had the blood of hundreds of American soldiers on his hands. Weakness and appeasement of Iran by the previous administration left the United States in a weaker position in the region and led to a deeply flawed Iran deal. Under the current president, we have taken a different tact, pulling out and seeking to reestablish against this rogue Iranian regime. General Tada, your testimony also highlights that Iran and its proxies have posed a threat for over 40 years. Why have the past strategies, including President Obama's nuclear deal, why have they failed to rein in Iran's hostile activities?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. I think part of it lies in the fact that Iran is a theocracy, and they will always, and as long as they are a theocracy fueled by extremist Islamic extremism, that they will always want to annihilate and remove Israel from the face of the earth, and they will always want to destroy America and Western values. Fundamentally, they are in opposition with the West. So from my point of view, that will not change as long as they are a theocracy fueled by fundamentalist Islam. And so the nuclear deal, just this year, we have the removal of the sanction to export arms that would come due and come out of the deal had it still been in effect. And in 3 years, they would be able to import centrifuges and ballistic missiles. 5 to 10 years to people in the Middle East is the bat of an eye, and it is something that they will provide a holding action while they continue to do things. And the deal did not prevent them from conducting terrorist attacks against the U.S. interests in the region. So it is this belief that we can conduct a deal with them that will result in some kind of peace. What we can have is deterrence, détente, and establish a power to counter their power in the region.
General Tata, what additional steps, those deterrents that you bring to the table, what would you recommend that we utilize moving forward to secure our homeland and to mitigate additional threats from Iran?
Thank you, Congressman. The additional steps I would recommend, I've mentioned a few. Ensure that we have robust intelligence capabilities in the Middle East to be able to pick up on the movement of these proxy groups and to determine how Iran is going to try to conduct more influence operations, whether or not that's kinetic or cyber, or and this administration is expert at pulling the levers of diplomatic, information, military, economic power and synchronizing them to achieve specific effects. And so they need to continue to do that. They struck with military precision, no collateral damage on a confirmed terrorist target and killed that target, removed him from the battlefield, and now we need to take a look at what lever of power can now be best applied to achieve our strategy that's well stated in the national security strategy, to achieve that strategy and move forward. And now that we have a deterrent effect in that region, maybe they will talk. Maybe they will come and achieve at least some sense of detente.
Thank you for your important information that you brought to us today, and I yield my remaining time.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Underwood, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since the events in Iran, I've been briefed by the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the Secretary of State, CIA Director Haspel, and the Acting Director of National Intelligence. In the briefings, I received information and intelligence regarding threats and the administration's efforts to keep us safe in the wake of the escalation. As I've learned more about the administration's military escalations in Iran, the question for me is, are we safer? And the answer, after much listening, reading, studying, questioning, and listening some more, is no. Americans and our allies are in greater danger. Our country is not safer in the wake of the Trump administration's recent actions. Without a doubt, General Soleimani got the fate he deserved, and Iran remains an adversary. But after examining the facts, we are on less stable footing in the region. The military has suspended counter-ISIS activities. More troops have been sent into a dangerous region. Iran is now closer to building a nuclear weapon than they were before the attack, and we are more isolated from our allies and partners. Ensuring the safety and security of Americans at home and abroad is my most important duty as a member of Congress. In order to do that, I voted for the War Powers Resolution, and I have pledged to work to keep our country safe from any counterattacks from Iran. In response to this administration's recent actions, we know that Iran is more likely to deploy asymmetrical operations on U.S. critical infrastructure and our allies. Because of this, the intelligence community continues to caution that a possible attack led by Iran or Iranian proxies would likely include a malicious cyber operation. Ambassador Leaf, General Stewart, and Mr. Warwick. As a nurse, I'm concerned about how vulnerable our country's hospitals are as targets of cyber attacks. What would a wiper or ransomware attack look like if carried out on a hospital?
Representative, this would be one of the most serious attacks against any community. As we have seen from ransomware attacks that have been tried, including some that Iran has had its hand in, anytime you have a situation like that, you're looking at the potential loss of patient records, inability to access medications, allergies, and other information that's necessary for the preservation of life and health. So this could be one of the most important types of targets an adversary might attack.
We continue to see adversaries look at the hospital system. And as Mr. Warwick pointed out earlier, we are all part of the attack surface because we all have a smart device of some sort. We plug into a Wi-Fi network that's unsecured. Almost every one of the devices in a hospital is on an unsecured network, which will allow folks to move laterally inside the network, steal data, disrupt systems. We're extremely vulnerable in the hospital and healthcare sector. And this is not just about stealing data, this is about impacting, we have hearing aids now that are Bluetooth enabled.
Right.
So all of our systems are connected and all of them create an attack surface from which you can move laterally and be destructive. And so I think it's a really important area to focus on securing our healthcare infrastructure. It's been targeted, it's a high priority for all of our potential adversaries and criminals. So it's an area that I think we really need to invest in and set some standards for securing the networks.
Yes, sir. Ambassador Leaf, did you want to add anything?
No, not on this topic.
Okay. What federal resources are available for hospital administrators to proactively address cybersecurity vulnerabilities against a cyber attack from either foreign adversaries?
I can't speak to that.
Yeah, there's advice that's available. There are tactics, techniques, and procedures, but the problem is, of course, that implementing them is most often left to the communities that fund those hospitals. It's not a subject of a massive federal grant that somehow solves the problem. It has to be done at the state and local level in the communities.
Right. So it sounds like it's an open vulnerability, and General Stewart mentioned stealing data, but there's also interruptions in service delivery, threats to individuals' health and wellness, and so this is something that I hope that this committee and our colleagues in Congress can address. General Stewart, in your testimony, you reiterate that the findings presented in the Worldwide Threats Assessment of 2019 that, quote, Iran is also attempting to deploy cyber attack capabilities that would enable attacks against critical infrastructure in the United States and allied countries. Can cyber attacks perpetrated by Iran and Iranian actors, such as the ransomware attacks in Baltimore and Atlanta, provide insight into the potential scope and magnitude of future cyber threats from Iran?
So the ransomware attacks that we'll see more of, by the way, it's a quick way to get funds. More and more companies are paying the ransom because they've seen the cost of Baltimore mitigating the ransomware attack. So these are criminal activities that could certainly be utilized by state actors to wipe data, to be disruptive, and ultimately be destructive on the network. So the techniques used for ransomware from the criminal standpoint are same techniques that a nation state could use to destroy data that they think is appropriate for destruction.
Thank you. As I stated before, as a member of Congress, it's my responsibility to ensure the safety and security of Americans at home and abroad. I'm committed to working with my colleagues in the House and on this committee so that the United States is prepared for all contingencies related to U.S.-Iran tensions, and I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York for 5 minutes, Mr. Katko.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, panelists, for being here. The discussion has been excellent, and I think the testimony has been very well taken. The situation in Iran has raised what I think is the biggest vulnerability in our country, and I think I just want to digress for a moment, which I normally ask questions. I do want to make some observations and ask a question. And I think the consensus is that the easiest and most perhaps effective way to fight back for state actors that are bad actors or individuals across the globe that are bad actors is cyber attacks. And I really do believe that we're having this discussion, we're talking about the things that talk about our concerns, we're talking about our vulnerabilities, just like we did before 9/11. And we didn't do enough before 9/11 to stop what happened on 9/11. And it's, to me, the biggest concern I have is the vulnerability to this country from cyber attacks. I think since 9/11, we've done a very good job in the anti-terrorism field. Not a perfect job, but a much better job. And look at the resources that we put into the post-9/11 era to make us safe from terrorist activities. And now we have this metastasizing problem of cybersecurity. And as I look at it, I do think it's the greatest threat to our country right now for some of the reasons we discussed today. And as I look at it, there's 4 areas I think we can focus on to really prioritize what we need to do. And then I want to ask you a couple of questions on it. And first is cybersecurity proficiency is the smaller the business, the smaller the family, the less knowledge they have on the issue, the bigger the problem. And banks, of course, have whole departments like you noted, but a lot of businesses can't afford that, and therefore their vulnerability is amazing. Target's major security breach happened because of a heating and air conditioning contractor gave the bad guys access into the system. That's what we've got to be thinking about. We're not thinking about it. The emerging technologies, some of us noticed, I think you noticed it, Lieutenant General, with respect to Fitbits and the watches that we have. The Internet of Things is coming, and the problems that that's going to pose for us. Every household in this country is going to have 20, 30, 40 devices that provide access to the Internet and provide backdoors to cyber attacks. That's another thing we need to think about. Even the supply chain issue with 5G technology and all of that. CISA and all CISA's doing. CISA is a young startup company, basically, and they're doing a wonderful job under unbelievably difficult circumstances. The ISACs they developed nationwide have been wonderful, but it's not enough. And then, of course, you have, on top of all that, you have let's beef this up, and you already have a shortage of 330 to 400,000 employees right now in this country for cybersecurity jobs, and they project that within the next year or 2 or 3, there'll be over 1 million person shortage. So how do you do that without drilling down and getting it into the school curriculums like you suggested? So this is a huge problem. And we have done as a committee, I think, a remarkably decent job of addressing it, trying to get funding to CISA, but it's nowhere near enough, and it takes much more than this committee. So with setting the doomsday scenario, I don't mean to do that, but at the same token, we got to acknowledge, tomorrow, if a bad actor wanted to flick a switch, they could take out a grid somewhere. They could affect our water supply systems. They're not doing it probably because we can do it to them, but also they probably view that we would view it as an act of war. So with all that being said, what should we be doing? I know we're talking about the problems. What should we be doing to try and look at this thing holistically, much better than we have right now? And Mr. Warwick, I'd ask you first.
Representative Katko, there's a lot that you've said I would certainly associate myself with. I think where we are as a country is that we have built an enormous part of our economy around an internet that simply grew up out of a series of decisions originally as a defense program that turned into something that frankly, from 50 years ago we would have thought as science fiction, and now we all carry around in our pockets more computing power than what it took to get Americans to the moon. But there has been no sort of equivalent security architecture to make that safe. This is going to require DHS, FBI, Cybercom, the entire technology-related security architecture of the United States to figure out how better to work with the private sector. We don't want the federal government dictating standards and reducing innovation. That comes from a combination of public and private measures that frankly have made our economy vibrant. But something more has to be done on security. One of the things that concerns me is that at DHS, over the past decade, since the department was founded, we have added missions, but we have not had resources added to match the missions that have been added. This committee, I know Mr. Higgins, I heard him at a hearing yesterday, make some important statements about the need for an authorization bill, and one of the things I'd ask you all to look at is the Department of Homeland Security adequately scoped for the missions that it now has, because they are different from what the department had when it was stood up in 2003. We are, I think, at a fundamental mismatch between the security needs and what's funded by the department and others to do right now.
Mr. Chairman, I'm out of time, but it is something I just think we have to spend a lot more time on it going forward.
Well, and there's no disagreement. I think you'll see some legislation proposed by Mr. Richmond to kind of close the loop on some of those unmet challenges that we face as a country. Chair recognizes the young lady from Michigan, Ms. Slotkin, for 5 minutes.
Thank you all for being here, for your testimony, and for the conversation. I am concerned, separate from the events that went on in the past couple of weeks, I'm concerned about looking forward and making sure we're doing everything we can to protect ourselves, and particularly to protect ourselves in our states and back home. I'm hosting a big call this Friday, just called Enhancing Readiness on Cyber Threats, for my state and local folks, for everything from election officials to town supervisors. And I wondered if you could, maybe General Stewart, walk us through very briefly, just to give people back home an understanding of how Iran is organized on cyber threats. You know, what does it look like? Is it someone in a headquarters? Is it a non-associated group under special cover? Just give us the literally 30-second version of how they're organized and perpetrate attacks.
By their own words, they have somewhere in the order of 2,000 or so folks organized from a strategic level through tactical levels, designed to, one, defend their networks, and two, develop capabilities to go after any targets, partnering with nation states. In their own words, again, we're looking for friends and partners who are friendly to us. They cited Russia, China, Pakistan as friendly partners. So they're organized at the strategic level, they're organized at the tactical level. They have specialized teams that conduct operations, both research and preparation for follow-on ops. And so they're well-structured throughout. They've made a commitment to this effort over the last 10 years.
And we know that in sort of modern-day cyber warfare, everybody is on the front lines. It's not traditional military or intelligence targets. We've talked about, and I think Representative Katko, who has now departed, is absolutely right that one day the other shoe is going to drop and we're all going to have this issue right in our face in a much more serious way. And I know, just as being a former CIA officer, after 9/11, we made a lot of progress on getting different intelligence community agencies to speak to each other and to have better communication. And then from the state or from the federal down to the state and local law enforcement. But what kind of things should we be doing if we're thinking about the future of CISA and DHS, Mr. Warwick? What kinds of things should we be looking for and pushing for to now take it to the next level so that we can be helping our businesses, small and large, protect themselves, since they are on the front lines?
Let me frame it this way. 60% of small and medium-sized business fail within 18 months of a breach in cybersecurity. That's the economic underpinning of our nation. 60% will fail within 18 months. Insider threats are the greatest threats. So we go back to, how do we educate the population? Because insiders, all of the companies that have reported a breach, generally these are from the inside. They all have firewalls, they all have antivirus, and it's some unknown entity inside that kicks off the attack. So we've got to do much better at coordinating at the national intelligence level, and I've seen significant coordination over the last 18 months. The piece that I think is still missing, and I mentioned this before, how do we move that from the national intelligence agencies down to DHS, who are overwhelmed? I've got to tell you, DHS does not have the number of folks in order to carry out all the missions that we've given them.
Right, so then let me just push you a little bit, because I have only a little bit of time, and maybe Mr. Warwick, you can answer this. Give us a vision of what right looks like. We've talked about how on a bipartisan basis, this committee is very supportive of enhancing the resources that CISA and DHS has generally. Structurally, if you are king for a day, how do we get from where we are to a better place?
Every American citizen needs to realize that they are a source of cyber vulnerability or cyber resilience and strength. They see the Department of Homeland Security providing a coordinating mechanism that shares and assimilates the information that we give back so that if an adversary starts to attack us, we can defend ourselves in microseconds. That's what the future needs to look like, and boy, are we not there right now. You're absolutely right.
And I would just offer in my remaining couple of seconds that similar to Representative Katko, I think we have an interesting opportunity to speak as a committee about what we want to see proactively. And I think CISA would welcome this, right? The opportunity to tell us how they get to right, since they're not resourced the way they need to be now. And I would welcome the opportunity for the DHS officials to come up here and offer those thoughts so that as we go into planning for next cycle, we can give them the resources they need to protect us or help protect us.
And we will. We've gotten a confirmation. The acting secretary is scheduled to come on March 3rd to defend the budget. And we'll look at that. The problem most often comes is when someone will ask the secretary, do you have all the money you need to keep us safe? And he will or she will generally say, I'm here to defend the numbers, we're here. So, we get there. But just like we put the additional $350 million in the budget for CISA last time, it was not in the budget, but we put it there. So, and it was all of us working together to make that happen. And so what I'm hearing now is that in a similar fashion, we'll have to kind of take it on ourselves to do the right thing. Thank you. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Guest, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To our distinguished panel, thank you for being here this morning. Thank you for what you do each and every day to keep our nation safe. General Tata, you provided to us a written statement that lists forth in that statement what you describe as Soleimani's legacy of terror. In there, you list that Iran has a $26 billion military budget, and that for 3 years, Iran, under Soleimani's leadership, has carried out 3 decades of terror against the United States. You go on to say that those include resources that Hezbollah has been provided to attack our ally nation of Israel in the Middle East. It talks about him creating money laundering schemes to fund terrorism, that following 9/11 that he was responsible for protecting the bin Laden family as well as al-Qaeda leadership. More recently, we have seen Iran and General Soleimani be involved in the shooting down of drones, the seizing of oil tankers in the Strait of Hormuz, the attacks on the Saudi oil fields, the killing of an American contractor, and the recent attacks on the United States Embassy in Baghdad. You go on to state that General Soleimani has killed or maimed more than 6,500 Americans, and that he posed a clear and present danger to Americans' interests across this globe. And you go on to say more so that he was more dangerous than Osama bin Laden himself. And then finally, you close by saying that Soleimani's years of zealously targeting Americans and killing them made him more dangerous than any other terrorist in recent times. Do you believe that President Trump acted responsibly in authorizing the strike that killed General Soleimani?
I do believe he acted responsibly, quickly, boldly, and it would have been irresponsible for him not to act.
And matter of fact, you go on in your report to say not only did he act responsibly, but you said he also acted decisively and proportionally. Would you expand on that very briefly?
Yeah, so it was, if you see the pictures, obviously there was no collateral damage. The 2 high-value targets were killed, which by definition makes the command and control of those militias and back to Iran much more challenging for that state actor and the non-state actors. So yes, it was under the use of authorization use of military force. Soleimani was heavily involved in transporting the bin Laden family and Taliban and other al-Qaeda members immediately after 9/11. That's very well documented. And he hosted them in Tehran for several years afterward. And he also moved Zarqawi from Afghanistan to Iran and then moved him into Iraq and resourced him. So there's no question that the AUMF applied to Soleimani and to Mohandas, quite frankly.
And General Tata, finally, as you close out your written statement, you say with Soleimani removed from the equation, we have an opportunity to positively reshape the dynamics in the Middle East toward peace and enhance homeland security. Do you believe that our homeland is safer today following the death of General Soleimani?
I do believe the homeland's safer today because Soleimani and his morale-building, vast reach that he has is no longer. And any time that you take out such a leader with flair and elan and networks and capabilities and resourcing, there is going to be an impact. It may be weeks, months, years, but there is an impact, and it gives us this opportunity to exploit that impact and say to Iran, we were serious about this. We will deter. We will defend. And do not do this again. Do not allow for these networks to resurge and become the threat that they once were. And I believe if we do that, we may be able to get a discussion going. We're going to be able to contain them, I think, and deter them. Until the theocracy's gone, I don't have any illusions that much will change as far as their willingness to do us harm.
And finally, General Tata, do you believe, and you say in your report, that with the death of General Soleimani, that this will help move the peace process forward in the Middle East?
No, he was totally counterproductive to the peace process. That was part of their Iran's two-pronged strategy was to pretend like they were deliberating in good faith and then to undermine all of our efforts in the Middle East, whether it's our interest with Israel, whether it's the interest in the Persian Gulf, whether it's our interest throughout Southwest Asia, by using Soleimani to conduct strikes. And so with him gone, we are safer, Congressman. And to add to some of the previous discussion, I would just say that in the Homeland here, I would hope that as we're doing legislation to make Homeland Security more robust, Mr. Chairman, that we would take a look at airports, seaports, railroads, energy systems, and their vulnerabilities with regard to cyber. Because now with Soleimani and all of them gone, this gives us a two-pronged opportunity to reshape in the Middle East and also to make more robust, as the discussion here has led to, our Homeland Security.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Barragan, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Ambassador Leaf and Mr. Warwick, what consequences may result from the suspension of counterterrorism operations against ISIS? And how should the administration be preparing for contingencies at home and abroad?
Well, Congresswoman, it really depends on how long this goes, and it goes back, endures, and it goes back to the issue I mentioned at the outset, which is it's quite critical for us to be navigating the turbulent waters in Iraq right now, and that's quite testing. There is a hard push to get our mission out. It is incumbent upon us to signal very clearly, very consistently to both privately and publicly that the cost to Iraq of that question, not just to us, but the cost will be significant. We will lose intelligence, we will lose the ability to have eyes on the problem.
Representative, every counterterrorism expert that you could get to come before this panel, in or out of government, will tell you ISIS is planning a resurgence. And the most dangerous thing, I would say, speaking for myself, is a terrorist safe haven from which they can plan attacks, recruit, train, build capacity, and thereby threaten the homeland. So the terrorist safe haven is the thing we most need to try to prevent. ISIS would like to establish one in eastern Syria or western Iraq, and that is a mission that I think we would neglect at our peril. So that would be the most important thing I think we need to be focused on is trying to help the Iraqi government build up the capability so that it can do that mission eventually by itself, but they're certainly not there yet.
Great. One of my concerns has been, we have seen over the last several years a focus by the administration on immigration. It's been such a focus that it feels as though they have been taking away focus and efforts in other parts of Homeland Security and other departments. We have also seen the president diverting funds from the military to build his border wall. He's been diverting billions of dollars. In September, there was a report that in Virginia, the state's cyber operations facility at Joint Base Langley will lose $10 million, just to give you an example. And so here we are talking about cyber threats, and we're talking about the potential increase, and there's money that's being diverted away from places like the cyber operations facility. Does anybody on this panel want to comment about whether the diversion of any funds from places like these cyber operations could pose an additional danger, given that they have less funding?
Maybe it's built into my Intel DNA that I'm hesitant to comment on policy decisions. But anytime you strip away capabilities, personnel from an area of like cybersecurity, that increases our risk and our vulnerabilities and risk, and it's probably not something I would do.
Okay. Anybody else? I mean, generally speaking, if you're investing less money into cyber operations, that's going to result in less information and preparation. Is that accurate?
I'm not an expert in this, Congresswoman. What I want to go back to is this issue of, are we safer today? I do not believe we are safer today, because I believe this is but a pause in this cycle that we are in, that we've been in with the Iranians for decades. And one of the members of the committee asked words to the effect of why did deterrence fail? When did it fail? It's failed over a period of time. And when you have a combination of this long-running cycle between the U.S. and Iran, and you have deterrence that shreds over time, and specifically I'm looking back at last summer when the Persian Gulf provided a sort of a testing theater for Iran. So I have no doubt that there's still payback to come from Iran, notwithstanding that Soleimani is gone. He was the national hero. He was like this with the Supreme Leader. The Supreme Leader has put himself on the record that missile strike is not enough. So cyber is the logical arena.
Well, thank you, and thank you for bringing that up. That was going to be one of my next questions. Is this the end of the revenge phase? I happen to represent the Port of Los Angeles, which is the busiest port, touches every congressional district, and they have had their own attacks on cyber operations, and this just increases that ability, and they can't just fend for themselves. The government is helping create some of these situations and making it worse, that we need to help them and invest. Thank you all for being here and for your testimony. I'm out of time. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Richmond, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Brigadier General Taylor, let me just go back, and I'm not trying to argue, but I think there's some inconsistencies. You said that we're safer today because Iran was in the position to start selling weapons. In a couple years, they would be able to buy and import centrifuges and all those things, and that they would never live up to a deal. Then you went on to say now, because of this killing and sanctions, that you believe that now's the time that they will enter in discussions. Well, either they're untruthful and they're never going to abide by a deal, or either they will. And so, and it's not based on who crafts the deal, whether it's President Obama or President Trump. Either they're good faith actors or they're not. I have no reason to believe that they are. However, I think we had the entire international community on our side under the Joint Comprehensive Plan. But let me ask another question, because this and this is not a got you. I have 20 years in elected office, and there's some things I hear over and over again that is just plain foolishness that makes us less safe. So one of the mantras from the other side is we have to do more with less. Can we protect more airports with less TSA agents? Anyone think we can? Does anyone think we could protect our internet, our local governments, and our cyber space with less money or less employees?
Congressman, since you addressed to me, I'd like to clarify something you said that I said, which I said we are more safe today because we have killed Iran's chief exporter of terror, Soleimani, and Mohandas, his chief executor of terror. So I believe that leadership matters and decisions matter with regard to capabilities. They're willing and able. They are less able today because the command and control of their chief terror network is gone.
And I didn't bring that part up. I just brought up the openness, willingness to honor and do a deal. But I want to be clear because I want the American people to understand that government has responsibilities. And part of those responsibilities, we're not just tax and spend Democrats. We want to protect the homeland, and you can't do it with less resources. So what I'm asking you all, please raise your hand if you think we can protect this space with less resources.
Representative Richmond, no, quite the contrary. Secretary John Kelly, General Kelly, a four-star Marine with whom I had worked when we were both in Iraq, and I proudly served when he was the Secretary of Homeland Security, famously told us in public and in private that the idea of doing less with less, or doing more with less rather, is in almost all cases a fantasy. I would agree with Secretary Kelly on that view. I think as stewards of the purse of the American public, it's your duty as members of Congress to make sure that money is spent wisely and well, and that officials are held accountable for providing results the way American citizens.
And reclaiming some of the time, but the point is that in this critical space, more resources are critical to success in defending our cyberspace. They only have to get lucky once, and we have to be successful 100% of the time. Let me ask you another question. Do you think that the lack of stability in terms of leadership at DHS causes some potential for concern?
Yes, absolutely. I'm very concerned, as all of us who have served in the department know. There are enormous advantages, and especially when you come to the kind of strategic rethinking of the department that can really best be done by senior officials and including political appointees who are confirmed in their positions by the Senate. And I would hope that actually, I believe it was Representative Higgins made this point at a hearing yesterday, that this is enormously important for the department to have more leadership confirmed by the Senate.
Very quickly, to the two generals. Do you think it's important, and do you think it's lawful for there to be a clear policy that answering cyber attacks doesn't necessarily have to be responded to with a cyber attack? I mean, can a cyber attack be so damaging to the U.S. that physical force response becomes appropriate and lawful? And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman. I do not believe that the signal should be a cyber attack will result in a counter cyber attack, that all options should be on the table depending on the severity of the cyber event. So kinetic action is certainly appropriate as a response to a cyber attack.
I agree with General Stewart.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses for your testimony today, as well as your service to the country. Before I begin my questions, I will say this on the issue of Soleimani. I don't regret for a minute that he is gone from the face of the planet. He was a murderer, terrorist, and a significant danger to the national security of the United States. The one problem I do have is with the overall lack of strategy, a strategic view of a strategy from this administration. That's the problem. They too often confuse tactical victories or decisions with somehow achieving strategic success, and it doesn't always add up that way. And I hope in the long run that we are safer as a result of Soleimani gone. I guess we're going to have to wait to see over time. General Stewart, good to see you again. Took me a minute to recognize you with the beard, but looking very distinguished. And I thank you for your service to the country and the many years that you and I have had interaction together. To you and Mr. Warwick, I want to discuss the Iranian cyber threat and trying to better coordinate between U.S. government activities and the private sector owners and operators of our critical infrastructure has certainly been a major focus of the Cyber Solarium Commission, which I'm currently serving, which is charged with creating an overall strategic framework guiding policy document to help better protect the country in cyberspace. Do you believe that there are clear lines between what companies should be doing to protect themselves? What additional steps should they be required to do through regulation or incentives? And what direct steps should the U.S. government be taking to protect national assets?
So Representative Langevin, I mean, I'm certainly familiar with the work of the Cyber Solarium, not as much as you are. At this point, I don't think that there is enough of a clear understanding among the American people as to what are the responsibilities of the private sector compared to the federal government. I think where we need to end up is a better understanding upon all citizens as to what their responsibilities are, because I think people need to do more. I think the government is going to have to be a shared partner in a lot of these activities so that it's not so much the federal government telling citizens what to do, but citizens and the federal government and state and local governments all working together towards a shared aim. We did that before in the 1950s on civil defense. We need to do it now.
We would not tell any organization in the private sector, if a missile was inbound on their target, that since it doesn't impact the Department of Defense or the broader government, good luck, you're on your own. But that's basically what we told them in terms of in cyberspace. Good luck, you're on your own. Do the best you can, harden your defenses. The cavalry is not coming.
Oh, but here's a brochure.
Here's a wonderful brochure called the following numbers in the event of a crisis. How do we get from point defense to what General Alexander calls collective defense? That requires a sharing arrangement where we're protecting our classified, but they're also protecting their proprietary information. In many cases, they're unwilling to share because it's proprietary and it translates to share value. So how do we create the environment where we can seamlessly share intelligence at a high enough classification level in a timely enough manner, and they can share proprietary information, and we have an environment where we have a good give and take between the private sector and public sector. There are models, international models, who are trying to do this, including sharing information to the private citizens when they're under attack. We need to accelerate how we do that. And the task force are not necessarily the answer. They're not well developed enough, and I'll stop there.
Well, on that point, let me ask you this. From your time at U.S. Cybercom and then also Ms. Work at DHS respectively, what is your assessment of the interagency coordination when surging proactive cyber defense activities in response to either a direct threat or a general time of heightened tensions?
I've actually seen that improve significantly, Congressman. Now I've been away for almost a year, but in some of the specific targets that we've had an interest, I've seen the interagency collaborate. I've seen them plan. I've seen the increased authorities that U.S. Cyber Command received, and so that interagency coordination looked like it was on the right path when I left the pattern in April. I don't know where it is today, but I saw significant progress over the previous year or so.
Well, I certainly won't dispute the General's statement that there's progress. I do have a somewhat different perspective. It starts out from the idea that when offensive cyber operations are planned, the defensive specialists are often not in the room. And that kind of thing, I think, will have to be changed in the future. But that's a long-term problem. We've got to understand, especially in the case of Iran, that anything we do to them, they will do back at us in some unusual way. What we need to recognize is that they know when they've been attacked, and they don't care who attacked them, whether it's us or somebody that may not be us, they could still take it out on us. And so we have to have much better coordination between our offensive cyber warriors and our defensive cyber specialists.
If I can just build on that, then I concur about having, it is important as we think of the question, are we safer, that we listen to what the Iranian leadership says. The artillery strikes are not enough. They can't defend everywhere. Americans are more vulnerable to cyber threats than any other nation because of their high level of dependency on cyber infrastructure. It is important for us to listen to what their leaders say.
And I would just add that in this continuum of Iranian attacks since 1979, that are we safer? We've never been truly safe. And the question is, did the Soleimani strike affect their ability to carry out certain types of attacks? And my contention is that it has.
Thank you all. Thank you. My time's expired. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes gentleman from Texas for 5 minutes, Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the ranking member as well. I especially thank the witnesses for appearing today. Has the extirpation of General Soleimani created any unintended consequences that are adverse to our best interests, Ambassador Leaf?
Congressman, I think that will take time to assess. With all due respect to my co-panelists, I don't agree that the Quds Force has really been dealt a significant blow. They're very resilient. I think there's predictability and method and rationality to the way Tehran comports itself. But the unexpected, I think you have to look a bit longer down the road.
Are the consequences of leaving Iraq on our own volition the same as being evicted, Ambassador Lee?
Absolutely not. Look, I think it's very important to recall that within Iraq itself, there is a wide body of support that did not exist in 2011. There's a wide body of public support for us to say they well recognize it's not just a question of the counter-ISIS fight, and Iraqis are aware that they do not have that capability yet. It's also when we leave, the coalition leaves. There's a shrinking of engagement with Iraq. Iraq becomes more isolated, more vulnerable to Iran's pressure. Again, going back to the issue of what it becomes for the region. And I assure you that our partners around the region are looking carefully at this question. Are we going to get pushed out? Are we going to let ourselves get pushed out?
Mr. Warwick, Nasrallah has command and control capabilities. He has probably one of the largest armies in the area that is not associated with a state. Is Nasrallah one of the rogue actors that you would be concerned with?
He's one of the most dangerous actors that we should concern ourselves with. He's not a rogue. But as both General Stewart and Ambassador Leaf said, the mission on which Qasem Soleimani was engaged in when he was killed in a strike was to build parallel state structures outside of the control of any government. That is a hugely dangerous proposition for the United States. This is what is creating the conditions that create forever wars. It's ironically not the United States. It's what Qasem Soleimani and his colleagues in the IRGC have been working on, and that's what makes it so dangerous.
The word on the street to use a pedestrian term, is that Iran received 150 billion US dollars, that we gave Iran 150 billion US dollars. Is it true that the money Iran received was money that we were able to deny Iran for some number of years?
Yes.
It was Iran's money.
Yes, that is legally what it was.
And is it true that the $150 billion is generally perceived by many, including the Treasury of the United States of America, as an inflated number?
Representative Green, you happen to have hit somebody whose wife was in the Office of Foreign Assets Control at Treasury and has worked on this issue for more than 20 years. Those were assets frozen by presidential order and were returned after a negotiation. So that's a simple legal description of what the money was.
Thank you. I happen to have intelligence indicating that $56 billion is the amount the Treasury has tagged. But continuing with my very last question, well, my time is up, but if I had the time, I'd ask you about the safety of American citizens, as with reference to lone wolves who tend to act on their own emotions, inspired by things that we can rarely understand, but I will not.
And I would say that you would be right in your concerns that lone wolves are one of the most difficult things for law enforcement and Homeland Security to try to prevent.
And I would just add, Congressman, that one thing that we should really look at is why did the Iranian military budget grow by over 60% between 2015 and 2018 to $26 billion?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You've been more than generous. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Let me thank the witnesses for your excellent testimony. I think you have gotten the committee in a good position to make some strong arguments from a budgetary standpoint that would help show up some known vulnerabilities, and we plan to use your testimony wisely in that effort. But we absolutely thank you for your forbearance on the questions, as well as your timely response from them. So thank you very much. Ranking Member, you had that. Well, I ask unanimous consent to submit a statement for the record from the Jewish Federation of North America about Homeland Security concerns related to Iranian proxies. I thank the witnesses again for their valuable testimony and the members for all their questions. The members of the committee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. Without objection, the committee record shall be kept open for 10 days. Hearing no further business, the committee stands adjourned.